Alright, CNT140, we are continuing on our Chapter 3 discussion. They do a couple reminders here on installing some different types of equipment. One of the first they talk about is like telephone equipment, and some special concerns when dealing with telephone equipment is the telephones themselves. When you're installing telephones, obviously making sure they're in the correct locations, or the box that you're installing is in the correct location for the phone needed. The punch-down blocks we're going to talk about in Chapter 4, but the punch-down blocks for terminating the phone cabling, make sure they are anchored correctly to the wall so that you can terminate them, because you actually need to use a punch-down tool and some force on them. If the blocks aren't mounted correctly, they're going to slide and you won't get good terminations, that kind of good thing. Wall jacks and connection mounts. Actually, I kind of said that a little bit earlier with your telephones, making sure, again, these are in the correct location for use. Terminate with the correct color code so that you do have correct pinouts and getting signal to the phone, that sort of thing. Equipment racks in the closet. A lot of times you're mounting equipment in the rack, so making sure that that equipment rack is anchored to the floor and you have adequate space in it, as well as space around that equipment rack, that you have access to it front and back for installing equipment, getting power to it, disconnecting things, moving things around, etc. And central consoles, these would be maybe like the phone switch kind of thing or the PBX kind of thing, making sure that is installed where that you can get connection from there to your termination blocks in the wall, punch down blocks in the wall. It does get power, it does get backup power, that kind of thing. So there's some concerns with telephone equipment. As we move on to video equipment, you may or may not have to deal with this again. In some systems you might have to deal with the security system, so you're going to be dealing with some video cabling, if you will. So in here, if you have any cameras mounted out in hallways, make sure they're mounted correct locations so that you are picking up the video feed that you need. They're going to need to be in some kind of bracket, whether it be on the wall, ceiling tile, that sort of thing. So making sure there's anchored correctly. Vibrations and wiggles and that sort of thing are going to distort the picture. And some cameras might need tilt and pan and that kind of stuff, so that might actually need a special bracket so that it can move correctly the directions you need it to. If you have any kind of motion detectors, those might be installed on a window, or not window frame, door frame. As people come and go, the camera activates, that sort of thing. Making sure they're located correctly to pick up the motion you need it to. And antennas and satellite receivers. If you have an antenna for sending or receiving a video signal, that needs to be mounted on an antenna outside, anchored. The cabling coming off, I should say the tower itself, needs to be grounded. Cabling coming off needs to be anchored through the building, all that kind of good stuff. So there might be some special cases there when dealing with some video equipment. Some other stuff, this is probably most likely what you're going to work with, especially a lot of you guys moving through networking degree, that sort of thing. You're probably going to be network admin kind of deal. So you'll be doing a lot of work with installing these kinds of network equipment. So with personal computers, obviously installing in correct rooms, making sure they're installed correctly, power to them, cables from the CPU up to the monitor, all that good jazz. Most computers come with multiple, or I should say come with a network card and or multiple network cards. Not a huge deal. They make a little bit more of a big deal about it than most things today. Most times today the network card is built into the motherboard, so just making sure that they're accessible, that you can plug and unplug them. The computers themselves, dealing with them, CPUs, small mainframes, that sort of thing, especially in the closet. If you're dealing with rack mountable servers or things like that, making sure that they are installed in the closet or the rack correctly, maybe in your server cabinet correctly. Make sure there's ventilation around them, make sure that there is power to them, and possibly even UPS battery backup to them. Obviously power line filtering coming to the unit, and maybe even battery backup for them, so they maintain connectivity even though the power in the building might flicker or go off. Your other network equipment, hubs, routers, switches, that sort of thing. Hubs, switches and routers in your equipment rack, obviously installed in the rack, ventilation around them, power to them. Again, these will probably need UPS or battery backup for them to maintain connectivity on the network even when the power flickers. your peripherals. These might be some other specialty equipment they go through here, and they talk about tape backups and drives and printers and modems, that sort of thing. Well, there might be other connections from the your ISP. You might be using a special box there to connect your equipment to theirs. You would need to make sure that's anchored correctly, powered, all that kind of good jazz. Any of those special kind of pieces of equipment, maybe multiplexers or that sort of thing. Make sure again they're installed correctly and have power to them and battery backup and that sort of thing. And they talk about software. Yeah, if you're dealing with any software, network operating systems, making sure they're installed correctly and you have backups of them, or those are cataloged or documented in some way so you know what's installed where, what versions of things are installed where. With all these installs, they mention a couple safety guidelines. You know, as you're installing special gear, make sure you are wearing your gloves and your safety glasses and those kind of things, and make sure you're not getting damaged. Sometimes just wearing gloves, work gloves, help. Sharp edges of things can cut you pretty bad, so that's helpful. As you're working above the ceiling or ceiling tiles, a lot of times safety glasses are ideal to keep the dust and things out of your eye as you're working on them. Locate and avoid all electric wiring, absolutely. As you're installing cabling above ceilings and all that kind of stuff, you need to know where these things are, look for them, avoid them, maybe even mark them, so you do not run into any of those. And obviously ladder safety, not climbing up on the top rung of the ladder, making sure the ladder is fully open, not climbing up the wrong side, maybe having a second person there helping you with the ladder, all that kind of good stuff. Yep, all those things are important too. So as you're doing the install, they remind us of a couple things that are important too. As you're installing, this could be telecom, this could be phone, this could even be data wiring for that matter. Some of your mistakes in this stuff is a little difficult to detect. Some things are easy, some things are a little bit more difficult. Some cable meters pick a lot of these things up, but then sometimes you have to bring out the really specialty cable meters, certifiers, to identify the smaller but more important problems, if you will. So it is very possible you do all this work, do all this install, and things don't really show up until you start bringing power, or I should say gear, online, and noticing you do not have connectivity, you do not have link lights, that sort of thing. And one single mistake, one single termination somewhere could cause things not function, especially if it's the run for the server or something like that that everybody needs to connect to. Maybe your DHCP server, the connection to the DHCP server is faulty, so everybody in that lab or that wing or that building does not have connectivity because they're not getting an IP address, blah blah blah. So one single bad connection could really cause some serious problems in your network. So they talk about when you're installing, you have to be diligent. Absolutely. It's one of those, I had a boss tell me once upon a time, you don't get told this very often, he's like, I'd rather you take your time and do it right the first time instead of hurrying and do it 3 times until you get it right. Now I was working in a place where materials were very expensive, so he wanted to make sure I was not wasting materials and trying to get it right the first time. But that's true of a lot of things. It's like, take the extra 5 minutes now, make sure it's right, get it right, so you're not redoing it 3 times and wasting more time in the long run. So making sure your terminations are done correctly. Yes. Follow the color codes, double check. As you first start terminating, print out the color code and leave it in your toolbox, your toolkit. Eventually you're going to memorize it, but for a little while have it there as reference. Make sure your staff is trained. You may not go to, when you get hired somewhere, you might go to training for, Cisco, or you might go to training for Microsoft or blah server or blah. It's very possible you might not go to a class on cable installation, but then again, you very well might. If you're doing lots of cable install, they might send you a class and make sure that you are trained. Make sure you're using all the right equipment, all the right parts. Some places stick with blah brand name. They might stick with everything Panduit, everything Leviton through their building. That way everything is the same, all the color codes are the same, all the terminations look the same. That way you're reducing the amount of mistakes and problems that you have in your network. Don't rush, don't hurry. I said that a little bit ago. Don't rush, don't hurry. Have an area that's well lit. You might need to, there's times I wear headlamps as I'm doing this, an actual, LED headlamp around my head so that I can get light on what I'm doing to make sure that my color code is correct. When you're done, make sure you get your test equipment out and use it. As we start doing terminations in our lab, as soon as we're able to, we're going to be hooking meters up and testing our cable run and making sure things do work correctly. Absolutely. Try to fix those problems right off the bat. One of the next things they mention is they talk about making sure that every cable run is terminated well, and then when you're done as well, making sure it's marked well. Don't lose track of any of your cable runs. As we install our first cable runs in our room, in our lab, we are going to mark our cable runs multiple times on both ends. And I'm just giving you an example here. They show you labeling using some scheme, and then here they even show you a special type of label, whatever, but making sure everything is labeled, and that's going to cut down on problems, and that's going to ease down the road with troubleshooting. It's going to help with troubleshooting significantly. And they're telling you here, make sure you're looking over the, kind of the shoulder of your employee to make sure things are done correctly. Might even spot check things. Check things as you go. One of the last things they talk about is inspections. I mentioned this earlier. It's going to be worthwhile if you're doing lots of installs in a particular area to kind of get to know who the inspector is and what they're looking for. That way you can install efficiently, have things ready when they come to check it, that sort of thing. And then eventually, if you are the boss installing lots of cabling, or I should say you become the team leader or whatever, you're going to have to become familiar with the NEC, specifically the 800 section on communication circuits, know the ins and outs and that sort of thing. Or at least initially follow your 568 standard. That incorporates a lot of these things in there that if you're doing it to the 568, you're probably crossing all the T's and dotting the I's in the NEC, the electrical code. They also, some inspectors give a lot of detail, cable labeling, that sort of thing. So make sure you know what they're looking for too. They also mention here at the very end that the NEC in the 800 section 852 requires the removal of abandoned cables as well to get rid of that fire hazard. So part of an install you might actually have to take the old cabling out too. There was a day people would just cut it free and leave it up there above the ceiling and all that jazz. Those days are kind of behind us. You normally have to get that out of there and dispose of that or recycle that correctly, if you will. So the NEC actually has requirements in there for getting rid of abandoned cabling, and they tell you about which ones: early coax, unused Cat3, unused Cat5, that sort of thing, and replace with the newer cabling that we're doing. Alrighty, so there's kind of like an overview of the install. As we come back in Chapter 4, we're going to dig into some of the details of the parts, how we're going to do it, the distances of things, and that sort of thing. But Chapter 3 kind of did a real quick overview of installing as well as the safety of the install too.